Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work as a school-based counselor at a school in Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, we'll have two questions from listeners today as we continue to get caught up on the questions you send in. The first one will be from Lori from New Jersey, and that will be with Julia. And if that question sounds familiar to you, it's because Lori sent in a question before, and after we recorded and hung up, Julia and I said, snap, we didn't answer the second half. So we'll be looking at how under-resourced schools that don't have very many APs, how do colleges assess rigor for high schools like that? We'll then continue with our roundtable discussion. And this time we have a question from Alison from Ohio, a college counselor. And we'll answer that in our roundtable. And then we'll continue on with our interview with Stephen Burd and Don Hossler as we put enrollment management under the microscope. And they talk about two big, very large companies in particular that are like the invisible hand behind so many admissions decisions, and so few people know what's actually happening behind the scenes. And then we have a brand new college spotlight. That's right, we're going old school, the kind we used to do a lot. Not where we interview a professional, but where we break down a recent visit and talk about the pros, the cons, our experience, who a school is good for and who it's not. And it's the University of South Carolina in Columbia. And Lisa will join me for that. Friends, be sure to sign up for our webinar with Matt Carpenter. It is on Tuesday, August 6th, and that's getting pretty close. And I know a lot of people have a lot of questions about paying for college. And that's what's going to happen in that webinar. You fire your questions away about paying for college, and Matt will answer them. He'll also talk a little bit about College Aid Pro and how that can help you get a sense of what your actual cost for college will be. Just go to yourcollegeboundkid.com, hit the events tab, and sign up for the August webinar. It's the 6th, which is a Tuesday, and that's 8:30 Eastern, 7:30 Central, 6:30 Mountain, and 5:30 Pacific. All our webinars start right on time and end right on time, and they go for an hour. All right, let's transition to my conversation with Julia.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Hey, Julia.
Hi, Mark.
You know, remember we started answering this question for Lori, and then we just said, see ya. We forgot that there was a part 2 in there. So we answered the highly resourced school question. I'm going to play the question again for our listeners, Lori from New Jersey, so we can answer the back half.
Hi, this is Lori from New Jersey, and I would love to get your insight on how selective schools are evaluating rigor in the context of highly resourced schools. So I hear you talk a lot about how colleges expect you to take the most rigorous curriculum, and they evaluate you in the context of your high school. So I'm wondering, what does that mean in a high school that offers the entire AP catalog and has tons of opportunity to challenge yourself with honors and accelerated classes? You know, what does top marks for rigor look like in that environment? Is taking 6 or 7 APs and then rounding out your transcript with a bunch of honors and accelerated going to get you top marks for rigor? Because by most measures, that's an incredibly rigorous curriculum. Or is it going to sort of get relegated to, say, a 4 out of 5 because someone else in the school has figured out how to take 10 or 12 APs, and thus it doesn't look as rigorous in the context of their particular high school. And then in contrast, I'm curious how you score rigor in less resource schools? Because I've heard you talk about how a kid can't be penalized if they don't have access, which sort of makes sense. But then I'm wondering, how do they get scored? Do they get sort of a neutral 3? Because some might argue that's being penalized. Or do they get a 5 out of 5 because they've done everything they can, even if there isn't a lot that's available to them? And I'm particularly curious about the contrast between these two scenarios, because I'm seeing a growing trend in my school where over the years, the level of rigor just keeps ratcheting up, and kids are taking more and more AP classes, and it's getting very stressful and very difficult. And so a bunch of people are moving their kids to private schools that intentionally don't offer these honors and AP classes, with the theory that then the kids won't have to challenge themselves as hard and they'll get higher marks. And since they can't be penalized for rigor, they'll be better off. And I'm just wondering, is there truth to that argument? Does that really happen? Or maybe the colleges, is there some way that they're recognizing those kids that stay in those more competitive high schools and sort of give it their best go, even if they don't end up being the most rigorous of the curriculums in their school? All right. Thanks so much. Really appreciate what you do.
Julia, I'll let you kick it off.
So apologies, Lori, and the great question. You can have under-resourced schools that just don't have the ability to administer an AP curriculum. But I will say, and again, my reader time is limited. I've only read for highly selective colleges, so you're not going to get a large swath of under-resourced schools. But by and large, a lot of the under-resourced schools do offer AP courses because you get a little funding. But then what I'll see is, I'll use the LA Unified School District as a great one.
Which you used to recruit from. That used to be part of your territory.
Yep. So I would say that the majority of the students who would come from maybe like a South Central high school or whatnot, maybe 2 to 4% of those students would go on to a 4-year college. Almost all of them took AP courses, and almost all of them scored 1s and 2s on the AP. And that's not because they didn't do well. It's because the school offered the AP, but the teacher, I remember I was reading a QuestBridge file once from outside of Los Angeles public school, and the rec was from an AP English language teacher. And they wrote, "This student, like me, also struggles with the English language. We speak Spanish primarily," but that was the AP English language teacher, right? And it's no fault of the student. It's just, it's an under-resourced school district. So they might get in some funding from College Board with the APs, but the teachers are not equipped to teach the curriculum in a way that a student might be able to score well. And for those of you who don't know, the AP curriculum is given by the College Board, is given to schools and teachers. Teachers do have some latitude about maybe the text they choose or when they do a unit, but you're required to get through sometimes what is 27 units by the time the AP test comes up, which is May. So that's a truncated school year for if you're trying to teach to the curriculum. And oftentimes students really struggle with, or school districts struggle with having that many school days to actually accurately teach that curriculum in time. So I share, maybe I'm going a little too much in the weeds, but I share all that to just kind of, just like SAT and ACT testing, the AP is not necessarily a good metric here either. But here's what I will say. It is absolutely true, Lori, that every school is considered in their own context. So I worked at a school that did not offer any APs. And yes, I had a reputation that followed me in a nice way. But what I would say is that it was never at a disadvantage. And that would also be true for low resource schools, is that they do, beyond the school profile, which we've talked about, is that the high schools are required to fill out what's called a school report form. And that's true for any application platform. So there's the Common App, the Coalition has one, but then even the University of California system has their own. Within the SRAR, students do need to put in some information about their school. So almost always the college will have information on if the high school offers APs or not. So when I was a reader and I come across a high school that was maybe under-resourced, I didn't see a lot of applications or no applications from them, and they didn't offer APs, I would really spend a long time on the school profile, and I would say, okay, well, there's no honors, APs, there's nothing, everything's the same level. So let me make sure the student took their 5 core subjects as many times as they could. Let's make sure the student, if the school did offer pre-calculus, the student took pre-calculus. So I'm looking at, even though the curriculum might look really different than the average admitted student, it was the best offered for that high school, and I'm not going to fault a student for that. The one time where I might have had to have waitlisted a student is that perhaps their high school did not prepare them for the rigors of the college I was reading for. And in those cases, we would waitlist the student, not because they weren't they weren't ready for us, it's that we weren't ready for them. It would have been a disservice to admit and fully fund probably that student and then find that they did not do well at the college. And that's not their fault at all. But I've read plenty of under-resourced schools that don't have, I should say highly resourced schools that don't have APs. And I've read schools that don't have APs, but have some honors or maybe a mix. Another thing that's really common in some low resource schools, and a lot of my College Horizon students had this as an option, is dual enrollment. So a lot of high schools partner with local community colleges, or some partner with online courses. If that is considered the most demanding, or it allows you to continue your limited curriculum, then I say take advantage of those if they're affordable and easy options.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is a college has to be convinced somebody can do the program. They have to be convinced. No admission officer wants a faculty member tapping them on the shoulder and saying, how did this kid get here? Because they can't do the work.
Right.
So part of this even influences where they travel, who they visit in the first place, and who gets their time and attention. If they're not convinced of the level of preparation is there, it can really make it hard for those schools for being deprioritized when it comes to who gets visits. But let's say you do visit a place and it's under-resourced, and you want everything within you wants to be able to take some kids from those schools, and you're not seeing sort of designations of rigor that you have learned to sort of respect and get comfortable with. What are the things that could give you confidence that a kid is admissible? You know, as much as Julie and I are not fans of testing, high testing is one of those things that can make a student appear as if they have the potential to do well at your school. Now, that's not, especially if it's coupled with strong academic performance, not talking about just testing with really low grades. So sometimes in those cases, there's going to be more weight on the testing, is one thing. Would you agree with that, Julia, before I go any further? Okay.
Especially, I would say, so when I worked at Haverford and I was the director of multicultural recruitment, we sort of had, and this is when scores were required, right? We had sort of a threshold score that our research showed that even though this student was coming from an underprepared, under-resourced background, if they could at least get past maybe this is a while ago, folks. So I'm talking about like Math 2, SAT 2. If they
it's a while ago because those tests are obsolete now.
Really gone. If they could clear a 500, our research showed that they could be successful with support. Whereas, you know, I once had a counselor get really mad at me when we didn't take a student and he was admitted at Amherst and Wesleyan, and the counselor was sort of like, why not? And it was just maybe perhaps Wesleyan and Amherst had better resources to support that student. And or their research showed differently but yes, absolutely. There's sort of, and this is a lot of MIT's return to standardized testing. There's sort of an idea that there's other metrics we can use or a threshold that we can, ethically admit a student. So that way they are set up for success.
Yeah, one of my favorite questions I used to like to ask everybody, I would get much more information on this. I still can get it now, but I would get more of it when I was on the school-based side, either when I was working at a CBO or doing college counseling at a charter school or at Westtown. I love to ask people, like, what numbers make you nervous and what numbers are almost cutoffs? This is the stuff that they're not going to say at an information session, in public. But they would give they would sometimes give school counselors that information. And sometimes schools would say, like, I can't go below a 550 on the math, or I need a 26 ACT or something like that. Like we can work with that. And that's that research piece.
Right.
You're hoping it's the research piece.
Yes.
Because it could
not
just
always
be
convinced.
Yes. Sometimes you think somebody just came up with a number versus research piece. But so that's one thing. It's going to put more of a premium on testing. The other thing is it's going to put more of a premium on your class rank. Because colleges are going to be a lot more confident that if they're going to take a chance on somebody that doesn't have the rigor, they're going to want that person to be way high up in their class.
Right.
Way high up in their class. And if that means there's rankings, very helpful. You can see them. I totally get why schools don't have rankings. And if I was a school-based counselor in an affluent suburb or an independent school, I wouldn't have rankings.
Yep. No.
But as an admission officer, I loved rankings. Did you love them, Julia? I love them as a reader.
I mean, I guess you're right. It was quicker for me, and also similar as the check boxes on the different counselor forms or teacher rec forms that come with a lot of college applications. Because that would be, if you're at a selective college, right? Like here, if somebody is top 1% versus top 25%, it can make a decision real quick for the reader. How about that? Yeah.
Yeah, because I want to know you're toward the top of your class, because there's just a lot of times when if somebody's toward the top of their class, they just have what Julie and I talked about recently. You have that drive and you have that work ethic and you have that discipline. That's the one thing I never mentioned when I was going over sort of character traits associated with success recently with you, Julia. I would say discipline is another really good one to combine with that drive and that work ethic.
Totally agree. Especially in college, it's a step up. So you might be a really high achieving person who puts in a decent amount of effort, but once you get to college, you're a little fish in a big pond a lot of the time, and you got to put in that extra effort.
And not just the effort, but the freedom of college.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
Yeah. Handling the freedom. High school is so structured.
Yep. And there's no hand holding.
Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes was by my former colleague, Terry James Solomon, who always said that one time she had a really high achieving student who was just getting a little rocked, right? And had been really doing well. They went to the academic skills center at their college and they're like, whoa, all the smart people are in here. Like, it's a good habit of mind. So even really highly successful, highly high achieving people do have that discipline to not plateau and keep up with the rigor.
Yeah. So that would be the other thing. So testing, high rank. And sometimes even if you don't have an explicit rank, if I'm reading by school group and I see a whole bunch of kids, like sometimes you can't get a precise rank, but you can get a feel from it, whether this kid is way up on the class, or you can get that from the school counselor. I want to say a little more about rankings. Some will argue using rankings are a crutch and it's lazy to use rankings. Others will say rankings are poisonous and toxic to school culture, and I totally understand and even agree with that. So my statement that class rankings or high school rankings can really help someone from an under-resourced school should not be interpreted as me saying, school counselor, your school should have rankings, because I would advocate against rankings and actually did that when I was on the school side, the placement side. I'm just referring to the file evaluation side. If you don't have a grade distribution or any AP, honors, advanced IB, or differentiation amongst the rigor of your classes, and your test optional, and you have widespread grade inflation, admission officers are going to look for some way to put your grades in context. This is one reason why the University of California system has, as one of their 13 criteria for admission, what they refer to as ELC, a fancy word for eligibility in local context. Basically just means you are in the top 1/9 of your high school class. And it's a way for readers of the University of California system to know who's at the top of the class. And then the other thing I would say would be your track record with that school.
Yeah.
That's a big one. You want to comment on that, Julian? How that can help an under-resourced school? Talk about that.
That's a great example. And I'll go back to my LA Unified School District, is that, when I first started recruiting in Los Angeles, my first year in admissions, I would sometimes show up to high schools where we had gotten applications, but no one enrolled, or we hadn't admitted. And then I would see no one, right? Most of the students I would see from under-resourced high schools either came through a community-based organization, right? Because they had some other resources that showed they could be successful. So at that point, what I started doing is finding the students we had that were part of those community-based organizations, finding their home high schools, and then starting to visit with their guidance counselors. And I would find that there's actually a lot of kids ahead of them in the class that just aren't enrolled in one of these community-based organizations. But I knew that even though these students had a CBO behind them, that their peers who were performing higher than them also were having similar success. And so if I knew that, I'm thinking of Benjamin Franklin High School in Los Angeles, we could, Haverford did really well with the top 20% of those students. They had those skills you were talking about, Mark, to do well, even if their high school didn't fully prepare them for the rigors of a selective college.
Yeah, because if you think about it, a lot of times schools have been applying to the schools over the years, and some schools do a lot better job of just keeping really in-depth institutional records and passing that on from one rep to another rep when territories switch. But if you look in your database and you see that, wow, we've had kids from here and they've done well, that absolutely can be a factor. There are a few other things, and I was just thinking about myself, Julia, because I was over recruitment, and so I had a lot of responsibilities like this to pick and choose schools that we would go to. Other things that could play a role. One is on-site evaluation from the admission officer, and they do an on-site evaluation. They're super impressed with the kids when let's say you do an information session, a Q&A, maybe you even sit in a class briefly, or you talk to counselors, and you're super impressed with the kids. That's the kind of thing that can lead to the regional rep telling, the rest of the team, this school so impressed me. I'm so impressed with these kids. And you may take a shot at someone, and then that can lead to good success. It works out. And then that's how you breed feeders.
Yep.
So your on-site visit. And then the last thing is something that I used to do when I was recruiting is I networked heavily with other admission officers. And I would be like, where are you getting your great kids? And
yes.
East Seattle or something like that. And then these are other schools and they're similar to you in rigor. So they're looking for a similar caliber. And then they tell you, oh, we're getting great kids from this school, that school, that school. That impacts, your view of the school or whether you add it to your travel calendar. Any thoughts on that one, Julia?
Totally. I shout out. I don't even think he's there anymore, but I loved this rep at Vanderbilt that I had that also was in Southern California with me. And by the time I finished, half of my travel was added because he had success with his students at some of these schools in the Los Angeles area. And then you also knew that had somewhat of a culture of students who were willing to go to a whole nother location of the country and do well and might show some interest. So absolutely, we definitely compare notes, and there's a lot of great resources for that for admission officers too.
Yeah, and Julia used the term CBO. If you're not familiar with that, I know most of our listeners are. That's a community-based organization. And so these are organizations that really want to help students, usually under-resourced students, that don't have access to be able to pay for a private counselor or get a professional counselor at an independent school. So they set up an organization to do college counseling, college support for students. So that's that term CBO that Julia used. Friends, Julia said something that was quite profound. I hope you didn't miss it. And truth be told, I actually missed it when we were recording, and I only caught it when I was editing myself. So I mentioned how I would rely a lot on talking to other AOs, admission officers, and conversations with them when I was traveling on the road. Where are you getting your great kids from this market? Or where are you getting your great kids from that market? As a way of surfacing some schools to consider adding to our travel calendar. But when I mentioned that, I was mostly focusing on asking these other AOs where they're finding kids who are very well prepared academically to be academically and socially successful. But remember, in admissions, you're recruiting in order to yield. And Julia added something to that conversation that's also very important. One thing you're always aware of is, will kids actually come a distance to your school? Will they travel that far? And so that's another thing that, you get when you sort of talk to your colleagues, especially if you're talking about recruiting a long ways away. I'll share a true story. I had Oakland, California as my territory for a while. And of course, I'm in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And I was primarily doing multicultural recruitment in that area and some under-resourced schools. And I was meeting great kids who were academically strong, no doubt in my mind they could do the program and be successful. But after a few years of going to a particular few schools in that area, I wasn't finding people that were willing to take that trip from Oakland all the way to Westchester. I found many academically qualified students, but they weren't willing to travel. So we stopped doing on-site visit to those schools. I don't know what we were doing. I think we were off our game, Julia. So I went back and listened to this question. Not only did we just get yapping away, and did we miss the component of Lori's question about under-resourced schools, but there's something else that she said that I just want to comment on about highly resourced schools, because she talked about people are feeling the pressure, and they're going to other schools and making different choices. So they don't have to show the 12 APs, the 14 APs, and this, that, the other.
Yeah.
The one thing I just want to emphasize is the problem is limited spaces. Like the spaces are limited, right? So it's not necessarily just an easy panacea to go to a school where the expectation is not that you take umpteen APs. That can be great for your mental health and not having to take all those courses. But I want to make sure that people know that that doesn't necessarily make it easier to get into highly selective options, because the problem is a space limitation option versus, one analogy I've been using with my families, and it's been working, Julia, is about this highly selective thing is I'll take whatever city they're from and I'll describe the time of rush hour and all the people flocking to get off one ramp to get onto the highway.
Right.
And so it's overcrowded and over jammed. And that's the problem at these schools right now, is just the supply so far exceeds the demand at the highly selectives. And so switching to another school may be the right move, and it may be great for mental health. But I don't want to imply that it all of a sudden makes it dramatically easier to waltz into selective U.
Yeah, no. And that's the most, I've only worked for highly resourced independent schools in a very high octane environment. That is the most common phrase I get from parents when the outcomes were not in the sub 2% admit rate, is that we should have just gone to our public school, or we should have just I should have moved to South Dakota. And I should have done, I should have gone to something, quote, less rigorous or easier to maybe achieve highly. But that is not the case.
I mean, I've come to realize that mentally, that's a lot easier for people than to just say, you know what, there's a lot of extraordinary students out there. My student, I think, is very gifted, but there's so many other extraordinary students out there for so few spots. So, God bless them. And we found a great place for us, even if it wasn't that. That, it's just, that's a lot to ask people to make that mental jump from a feeling good about myself kind of position. So some of that's a defense mechanism to just feel good about myself anyway, even that I don't like my results.
Right.
Thanks, Julia.
Thank you.
Friends, our roundtable consists of 4 members of our co-host team that have been both on the admission side and on what we call the other side of the desk, the placement side. We've got Julia in Massachusetts, Susan in Philadelphia, Vince in California, and I'm in Metro Atlanta. And we're also joined by Hillary Dickman, who's actually in the admission office, not just reading files, but in committee. So we get that perspective at Colorado College. We have one roundtable question this week and one more next week. Let us know if you like this roundtable format, and we'll seriously consider coming back and doing it again. For now, let's dive in with the roundtable. Well, our next question comes from lots of different titles here. The question is from Alison Merzal, and Alison is a college counselor. And she's also been on our podcast before. She did an outstanding interview on anti-Semitism and how Jewish students can tell if a place is academically safe. So she's coming to us from the great state of Ohio. She has a question that I will play now.
Hey, Mark and team, it's Alison Merzel calling. I know you are going to have a roundtable speaking about the honors section of the Common App, and I do have a question. The Cum Laude Society is an association of 382 chapters in public schools, independent schools in the United States and abroad. And when the students are filling out the honors section, they are certainly identified through their high school as being inducted into the Cum Laude Society. But is this something that also garners recognition at the national level, or does it just remain at the high school? I think this is probably a similar question as to National Honor Society, but I thought I would bring it up in case you feel it is worthwhile to discuss during the roundtable. Thank you always for all that you do. We appreciate you.
Well, Mark, my understanding is that Cum Laude is the independent school version of National Honor Society, if I'm not mistaken. Can anyone?
It really can. I've worked at multiple schools where it's different for each one. Like some, it's like the top quote, even though they don't rank, maybe it's the top 10%. At Milton, it was an A- average, but irregardless, or I hate that word, sorry, it did not consider rigor. So you could have taken like all art classes and still be cum laude. And then some schools, it's just a senior year distinction. So it doesn't even matter for colleges. Like you get it when you, so every school treats it differently. But yes, I think the quickest version is saying some kind of academic distinction where you have some sort of set of grades that say you're in the, top percentage, where there might be a community engagement component, or there might not be. It might just be, hey, you've got this GPA or these grades, and so you're cum laude.
And it's school-based. So in response to Alison's questions, it would not be national. It's a school criterion.
Do you see it, Hillary, much? Is it something that shows up a lot? No,
I don't see it very often. I feel like that could be something good for the counselor to contextualize. And I think it's if you feel like that's really important, when your student is meeting with their counselor in the fall, they should be advocating for things that are important to them that they want included in the counselor letter, or at least having a conversation with their counselor about that. And if that is something that you feel strongly about, then ask for your counselor to give context to that in their counselor letter.
Yeah, and depending on what the definition is, I think if it was defined, top 10%, some schools go as high as 15%. If you tell the reader what they're looking at, you're kind of saying I'm in the top part of the class. And in highly selective process, that could make the difference, because that's literally the only tip off. You get schools that don't give you anything, but if they give them that, it says a lot.
Yeah, if there's no grade distribution and no class rank, that could be really helpful.
Yeah, and that's a source of frustration. And as I interact with different admission officers, sometimes that some schools hide the context. They really hide it because there's no grade distribution, there's no rank, and it can make it difficult to put a student in their academic context. Julia, you want to say something? I see a reaction over there from you.
I want to say something.
Why don't you talk about on your reader side, not your school side? Maybe you could talk about it there.
Yes, I just happened to, I'm fine to say this. So Milton had cum laude when I got there, and it was mostly a senior distinction, but there would sometimes be these one or two at the most juniors who would be like holding their own with some sort of, string of A-. And then Milton, just like many independent schools and public schools, had such significant grade inflation with COVID that half the class became eligible for cum laude. So, and as they say, if everyone's special, no one's special, right? And so they got rid of that, but then we also got rid of the grade distribution chart on our school profile because it wasn't accurate to, the other thing about this is, again, how independent schools take up space is I have 500 English classes that a junior can take. And instead of listing all of those for Hillary to like fall asleep to at night, it would be, you know, all junior English. So just because you got a teacher that doesn't issue A pluses, or you signed up for a more rigorous English class, you'd be lumped in the grade distribution chart. Or like you decided to take a foreign language that was different than someone else. And is that comparable? So in some ways, I know it's really annoying for admission officers, and I'm sorry, but I also think it served our students best to look at them individually rather than look at them in the grade distribution chart. So I understand why Milton did that, and was very much in support of that, because it was not, the grade distribution chart was not an accurate, or cum laude was not an accurate metric of where the student might have been in the class or what would be a strong student at Milton.
I think also
you can see why people find this confusing. Go ahead, Hillary.
Yeah, I think also at a place like Milton and most independent schools, probably, like, we know that the students are academically prepared, and so it's less important, right? Like, even if they're getting B's and maybe they have a C, they're probably going to do fine in college if they try and take advantage of the resources that are available to them. So it's not as big of a deal as at schools that are sort of unknown to us, when it really helps to have a grade distribution. And sometimes it can help the students who are in the top of the class, because if they're rigorous schools and you don't have a grade distribution, then the kids who are in the top of the class, we just don't know that that they're, you know, the tippy top, which is a bummer for them because we're so used to the grade inflation kind of across the board.
Right. And the school I work for now has not had grade inflation. They've kept the grade distribution chart and a GPA sort of like bands, if you will. And that is helpful, just as Hillary said, because there hasn't been grade inflation. So that does not mean the kids who are getting C's or B's are like the bottom. There just hasn't been grade inflation. So, and probably my favorite and most embarrassing story as an admission officer is my first year, I first read New York City. And I had an independent school called Collegiate, which and you know, reading for Haverford, I was really accustomed to not taking a student outside of the 10% of their class, and so I like went through that whole collegiate school group, and I was like, deny. We admitted every single one of them, and because Haverford was very happy to admit anyone in their top 80%, because it was such a, as Hillary said, it was such a rigorous school. The kids were more than prepared. It mattered less that they weren't, you know, the number one kid, because they were all so strong, right? So it's, again, very contextual from school to school.
Although Julia, as you've said in recent podcasts, you went back to reading there after having been gone for about a decade, and you couldn't believe how much the bar had changed.
Oh, yes.
So
I don't know how you do
not
this.
Not necessarily true that 80% of all the collegiate kids would be getting in today, right?
No,
so I think
there's no space. Good luck, everybody.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, it's time for part 2 of 3 of my interview with Don Hossler and Stephen Burd on enrollment management. In part 2, Don shares the positive side of enrollment management. I asked Don some very tough ethical questions about common enrollment management practices, and Don shares his view on whether he thinks these practices cross the line of being ethical, or are they okay? Stephen speaks up about what he finds troubling. Don chimes in and tells us what a Mondo scholarship is, and he explains why he has such a huge issue with Mondo scholarships. Don talks about the enormous pressure that senior admission leaders are under to bring in net tuition revenue and achieve the goals that are almost impossible. And he talks about the turnover rate in the profession. Stephen talks about what he refers to as the perverse incentive structure that enrollment management fosters. And I pushed back a bit and asked Stephen some tough questions to bring out another way to look at things. Don and Stephen talk about the role U.S. News and World Report rankings play in making things worse. Listen and enjoy. Let's start out with the positive, because, and Don, in your chapter in the book, you brought out both sides, I felt. And if people are wondering what's going on in the chapter, so Stephen is actually the editor of the book. He does have a chapter, but you interview a number of thought leaders with expertise in different dimensions of enrollment management. So I'm sure some people might say, Stephen, in response, well, if we didn't do financial aid leveraging, we'd probably be closed. And isn't it better to do some things where you plug your nose a little bit, but we can still be around and serve students than be closed? But I'd love to hear.
I would say, before you get to Don, I would say if you're loading down low-income students with plus loans, their families with plus loans, I would question whether it actually is better for you to be open and serving students.
Right.
I think that's
although
an
not
open
everybody
question.
does that.
No, not everyone does it,
yeah.
but I wouldn't say that it just staying open, even if you are putting families in harm's way, that does worry me.
I mean, I'd probably share your ire, and I've articulated many times on the podcast, as recently as the episode that went live today, about my disdain for Parent Plus loans that can be borrowed up to the cost of attendance for a family that may make less than that, because they only look at adverse credit history and they don't do any debt-to-income ratios or any vetting. And I intentionally brought up your partnership with You Aspire because I wanted to sort of underscore that important work that you did exposing that. So we're simpatico on that. But Don, share the positive side of enrollment management. How can enrollment management be a good thing? Because you do bring out some of this in your chapter.
Well, I mean, I tend to view a lot of these things more along a continuum.
Yeah.
And, it's just kind of either or. So for example, and of course I'm a big believer in research-informed practice. So shortly, I don't know if I've ever written about this, but within the first couple of years I was at IU, I realized we weren't really proactively reaching out to kids. We started getting the names of kids when they were juniors. And one of the things that research shows pretty clearly is low-income students are much more likely to go to college if the earlier they have a sense of what college might cost, and therefore whether it is a realistic option for them, the more likely they are to go. So we started trying to get some. It's a fine line because financial aid officers, of course, are very nervous about sending something out that makes it sound every kid just like this will get exactly this much money, because then they get 1,000 calls that, well, my son's just like this and he got $1.25 less. What's going on? So that they're appropriately very nervous about saying too much. But we started providing information to students, especially low kids that were from, we didn't have all the information yet, but we knew they were attending schools where 50% of the students were on free and reduced lunch. So the odds were higher they're going to be low income students. So we started providing information earlier to them about the kind of range of costs they were likely to do. For me, that's an example of breaking down a barrier that had some good effects. When I first got there, the person who was handling, I guess what you would call the merit scholarships, was telling me, yeah, we have this great yield on the offers we make to kids. And they were sending out the award letters in April, May, and June, to which my response was, well, yeah, if you offer financial aid to someone who's already decided they're coming, they will accept it. So having some sense of that kind of timing, I think this could be kind of ugly on one hand, but I didn't hire a consultant to do that. Well, actually, we hired a consultant for a couple of years to basically teach us how to do this. But then we had our own staff. I had a spreadsheet that in real live time, you could see if you moved money this way, the effect it would have on the diversity of the enrolled student body, the effect it would have on the average SAT score, the effect it would have on income. I mean, those are all real trade-off issues. I mean, I don't think there's a senior administrator in any field, including higher ed, that doesn't have to make some of those trade-off decisions unless maybe they're Princeton, Haverford, et cetera, with huge endowments per student. And I don't find anything inherently wrong with having access to that information. Where I have real problems with it is if you're using it to do. Here's an interesting question for you. So, what is the responsibility of a public university to meet need for an out-of-state student who is not a taxpayer? I bring that up because, in fact, we had those discussions. About 40% of our students were from out of state.
Sure.
And the chancellor believed very strong. He cared about need for in-state students, but he said we don't really have an obligation to students who are not citizens of the state of Indiana. Now, it turned out our financial aid director, she was doing this before I got there, and she continued to do it. They actually, for some out-of-state students, she advised them not to come. She said it was too expensive, and we ought to all want to be efficient with the resources we have. So being more analytical about who's in your applicant pool and who's more or less likely to enroll, with, again, the caveat that especially within the state a public university is located, they ought to be recruiting in every high school, regardless of the average income of the students at those high schools. But I want to use my resources wisely. My job is not to spend as much money as possible. My job is to leave as much money on the table to do this little thing called instruction and research, which is the purpose of the university. So if I can use data to help me better identify, this is a group of students who, if we look over the last 3 years, yes, they expressed interest, but students with these attributes almost never enroll. I'm going to use that information to spend my money in other areas, so I'm not wasting it. So, I mean, I firmly believe there are positive benefits, even to the analytics side of things. A lot of it ultimately falls on the side, though. So once you have that information, what do you do with it?
No, well said. So here's a couple of financial aid leveraging tactics that are out there. Tell me what you think of them. One of them is to give more money to maybe a weaker student because you can still get more net tuition revenue from the family. So it's a family that doesn't qualify, but you're trying to get a certain amount of net tuition revenue, and your metrics from your enrollment management company or third party that you're working with indicates that $10,000 gift here might be enough to yield this kid. So you give it to the 3.2 student and you don't give it to the 3.7 student. Now, we know students are much more than their GPA. So I'm just using that as very shorthand way of saying one kid is not as strong as another kid. I really want to emphasize, we know kids are more than their GPA. But okay. So what does that feel to you like? Hey, you got to spread your dollars to bring in the net tuition revenue, and we need people that can pay, or does that feel like it crosses an ethical line?
Well, I thought you were going to, when you said, talking about academic qualifications, I thought maybe you were talking about students who might be so weak that they might not be able to be successful. That would be a huge ethical issue.
Right.
Well, I'll tell you, when I became vice chancellor, I had a pretty good idea of how much merit aid it would take to attract the very best students in state or out of state. And so our strategy was what I would say we gave merit aid awards to pretty good out of state students. Does that mean the 3.7 student didn't get the offer? No. What it does mean, though, is that he might have gotten the same offer as the 3.2, and we had data that showed that probably wouldn't be enough to influence his decision. And a lot of public universities, I think, the enrollment management wagon more about recruiting out-of-state students because of the tuition differentials.
Right. And of course, part of the backdrop, you guys talk about this so much in your book, is the state disinvestment in public schools and the federal disinvestment. Trace that back to the Reagan administration. So that puts schools in a quandary where you have to pass the costs on to the student, to the family. So then if you need to do that, it almost seems like it's inevitable. Then you need to find some families that can pay the amount. So I never heard you say this, Don, but I felt like what was implied was that's not unsavory. That's just part of your other goal, which is to bring in enough net tuition revenue to pay the faculty and keep the facilities alive and all the other responsibilities. Like, that's just one of the things you may have to do. But if you're bringing in an unqualified student, it crosses a line. But maybe if it's a student that's not quite as strong, but they can help with the bills, that falls within the realm of fair and legit. Am I putting words in your mouth, or would you say that's fair?
My ethics were not challenged by that. Where they became challenged is when I started, as I write about in the book, is when I started to realize that we weren't doing enough for not zero EFC kids, again, in-state kids, between federal and Indiana at that time had a pretty progressive state scholarship program. Zero EFC kids were okay. The kids that were turning out having they weren't having to pay 10. This is several years ago now. They weren't having to pay $10,000 or $15,000 out of a year, but they were ending up with bills $5,000, $6,000, $7,000. And for me, then the question of spending money on merit aid juxtaposed against what you're not doing for those kids, that becomes an ethical issue.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
This is Linda with this week's recommended resource, Mama Bear Legal Forms. When your 18-year-old goes off to college, they are considered an adult, and families need to ensure they're protected in medical and financial matters. Mama Bear offers an easy-to-use, state-specific legal form set that includes a financial power of attorney, healthcare power of attorney, and a HIPAA release so you can access your students' health information. Designed to provide peace of mind, which can be tough to come by when navigating young adults going off to college, these essential legal documents are available at an affordable price. Learn more at mamabearlegalforms.com.
I think one of the things that's really interesting in your question is that it sort of goes to these definitions that we use and the confusion that parents then have and students have, because you're giving money, say, to the not so good student, but we're still calling it merit aid. And so there is like this real big emphasis on not like being straight with people. Like, nobody says from a college, what we're doing here is we're getting you because you're rich.
I really have so much respect for Stephen's ethical compass, as well as his passion for giving opportunities to under-resourced students. But I really felt I did miss an opportunity here to say, Stephen, do you really expect an admission officer whose job is to enroll a class to please all of his stakeholders to say to students and parents, we're about to give you a scholarship because you're rich?
You know, we're going to give you because you have money to bring in. They say no. They say we're giving you a merit award because your student is so great. So then I would think that the kid who got the 3.7 is sort of like, wait a minute, I'm better than the kid with the 3.2. Why am I not getting it? So I think there's a real like, it's just interesting to me that colleges still sort of pretend that they're operating in a way that they're not operating in anymore. People still think of financial aid as going to students who really need the help. People still think that merit aid is going to the very best students, and they don't realize, that income, that family's income is that really what the school is trying to do is to get the full pay students.
Of course, I'll tell you a scholarship. Both of you know the term Mondo scholarships.
No.
Mongo? No.
Mondo, Mondo. So that's kind of shorthand for these merit scholarships. That it'll cover tuition, room, and board. Includes $10,000 for them to spending one semester studying overseas.
Oh, I call them cost of attendance scholarships usually.
I had a huge ethical issue with those because the kind of background for the kids who are qualifying for those, they're just not upper middle class. Some of them are middle class. Most of them are somewhere in the top 10%. They've had all the advantages.
Yeah.
To qualify for these scholarships, they already had to have traveled the world, written an essay about how working with poor kids in India affected those scholarships. I have huge. So we're giving money and often giving the smallest classes more attention to the most advantaged people who need it least. And then we later on say, look at all the great things they do. Well, aren't we great for having turned out students like this?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, so to me, part of it is just, one of the funny things is that I was in a relationship with someone and their daughter was offered a merit scholarship. And she said, isn't this great? Isn't this wonderful? Look, my daughter got this merit scholarship. And I said, well, the real reason why they're giving this to you is because this was someone who was extremely wealthy. That almost ended the relationship. She was like, she said, why do you always have to bring your work with you? But anyway, they want the parents to be able to brag about it and the kids to feel good.
Well, the part that's hard is unilaterally disarming when it's the industry standard and it's super, super competitive out there. Like, it's very difficult to do when people are applying to 20 schools and, if everyone's throwing money at them, like, you have to be so much better to yield a kid that it's just very, very challenging. And then all the pressure that you're getting from everyone, from president to provost to faculty to alumni to, current students, current parents, deans, you name it, rating agencies, and then even like the credit agencies factoring things like this into their loan rates, the Moody's and the Fitches and Standard & Poor's. So it's like a avalanche of pressure. I'm sure you know about that. Can you speak to the pressure the VP of enrollment, Vice Provost of enrollment feels to have to deliver not only the numbers, meaning full enrollment, but showing that you're upgrading the quality of the staff, of the students, and based on traditional metrics? Can you speak to that pressure, Don?
I think the pressure is tremendous. I'm actually pleased to say my chancellor, I never had that kind of pressure. He was not regularly asking where we were in U.S. News and how we could climb the ladder and stuff. He was a very, very humane guy. So
but I'm sure you know of others who do.
Oh my gosh! And I think right now, for smaller regional privates, those poor folks, most of them, they're not under pressure to raise the quality. They're under tremendous pressure to bring in enough students to keep the lights on. But there are certainly still presidents who end up at public flagships and somewhere between pretty good and very good privates who want to move up the ladder for sure. I've told Steve, I actually mentioned it in the book, and I've thought about writing a piece for Inside Higher Ed I mean, the average tenure of a college president now is between 5.5 and 7 years.
Mm-hmm. You have that in the book.
You can't, yeah. So I mean, as you read there, I mean, here are the things presidents get evaluated on. Did they bring in a lot of outside money? Did they hire faculty who turned out to be really great faculty and helped make the university famous? Did they build buildings, or did they do something to either increase the size of the entering class or improve the quality? Well, the only thing you can do for sure in 5.5, 7 years is something with enrollment. Raising the money to build buildings, unless you happen to walk in and somebody had just donated the money, takes time to build those relationships. When you hire faculty, you never know for sure how they're going to turn out until years. So for some schools, for upwardly aspiring presidents and provosts who are already plotting their next move to the next institution higher up, I think there's a great deal of pressure on one way or another improving the quality.
But here's a question I have about this: is like, it shows like enrollment management is it's sort of like the stock market. Why do you need a better class? Why do you need a better class every single time? Every single year. Why do we have to live by these metrics that if we don't have a higher SAT score or a better grade, like why does every class have to be better than the last? Like, it's almost like the quarterly earnings reports that you have on Wall Street, that this kind of mentality. And to me, that is the enrollment management mentality that's coming through rankings and through, and I think it is, I think these are perverse incentives, because where I agree, obviously you need to keep the lights on. So that's like number one. But you have very wealthy institutions. We're not talking about that every college that is doing this is like barely surviving. You've got institutions with billion-dollar enrollments that are in this game. And yeah, they don't want to unilaterally disarm. But they play this game that every year we have to brag about like the better students that we have, but it just.
But I'm going to push back on that a bit,
Yeah.
Stephen. So I think it's difficult, and I'm not saying there's not perverse incentive structures, but I think it's difficult to expect somebody to do something that is against every way in which you're evaluated by the people that you report to.
Well, we've got to change those incentives, and we've got to change how you're evaluated.
But most people, like, this is the way I like to explain it. If you're halfway stable as a school, nobody's really impressed that you're full. All the people you report to, for you to say that you had full enrollment, that's not going to impress people. They're going to go to certain qualitative metrics. Maybe they're trying to build a new $200 million science center, or whatever they're trying to do. They're going to look at, are you advancing and they oftentimes might even see it as the mission and vision of the school. Like, we can't, I don't want to sound like an apologist for, I do think the tail's wagging the dog. And I do think that a lot of the big enrollment management companies that are purely driven oftentimes by pure capitalism, it's hard sometimes to say, giving them carte blanche when you're a mission-based nonprofit to, hey, tell me what I need to do and tell me how high I need to jump, and I'll jump that high. Like, I do see inherent conflict there. I said on the podcast, it's almost like a pastor who his church is struggling to grow, and he hears that there's a casino operator in Las Vegas that's growing these casinos really, really quickly. And so he says, hey, I need to sign up for this guy's, course in philosophy of how do I grow my institution. I don't want to be an apologist for everything, but I also feel like I don't know what job an employer will buck the way they're evaluated and just go and be a renegade and be a maverick. Normally that's a quick recipe for a pink slip pretty fast.
Well, there have been cases of it. I mean, there have been institutions that have bucked
Sure,
it.
like Reed.
Reed. I mean, when Syracuse University, when Nancy Cantor was there, became all about inclusion.
But don't you think those times when you see that, I mean, Vassar did a lot along financial aid. Every time I see that, they have the support of someone above them. They have like the mandate from,
Right.
From the people above them to do that.
Right. Well, that's what we need to do, is to change the incentive structure so that the mandate isn't always about exclusion. I think one of the problems I've seen with enrollment management and rankings, and a lot of what happened was, and I think that Neil Schweide does this really well in the first chapters, to show sort of how U.S. News and enrollment management sort of came in as two separate forces in the late 80s, and kind of converged. And what happened is U.S. News sort of started to provide the blueprint for what these enrollment management firms were selling to the colleges, with this idea, like, we will give you the magic to rise up the rankings. We'll tell you.
Yeah, I mean,
how,
U.S. News created the illusion that institutional quality was easily measured and tangible.
Yeah, and I think these have been very destructive incentives. I understand.
Absolutely.
The other point about it too is, I do want to get, like, with the enrollment, I do think that there are good campus enrollment managers. I do think there are people who use it, and they can use enrollment management in good and beneficial ways. But the firms, which, as you said, are part of the capitalist, pure capitalism, they don't have a mission. They don't have a mission statement that the colleges have, because most college mission statements include wanting to provide opportunity.
Do you think it's fair to take all of the firms and do one broad stroke with the brush? Because I think there's differences within there as well.
I would say the major firms, the biggest firms, and I really am talking about EAB and Noah Levitz.
Right.
I'm not trying to talk about every firm.
Yeah, because I don't want to sing the praises of this group too much, and Don, you can correct me, but human capital management is a one that several people I know use, and what I've been told
things about them. Is that Brian?
Yeah. What I've been told is their price is so much lower than a few of the ones you referenced. And I've had demoed the incredible amount of research that they produce. And I'll tell you what, I was ready to sign up right then if I was a VP of enrollment. I was like, oh my goodness, you're going to give me this level of information? It was incredible. And then I'm told they do it at a good price.
I used to, as a reporter, I used to talk to Brian Zucker. I think his name is Zucker. Always one of the best, but they're a smaller firm. What I'm talking about are the giant firms. And
you're talking about stuff like EAB that makes you use their software, and therefore you have to spend a tremendous amount and be locked into their system.
You're locked into their system.
And you talked about in the book how they've taken over they've taken over CapEx, and now they're competing to generate their own stream of lead management and locking you into their system.
And they're also encouraging colleges to leverage all of their aid. And that is a huge thing, because at that point, you're gapping, that leaves you with no choice but to gap the lowest income.
Well, yes, some of these firms claim that they will optimize the package for every individual student. I find that repulsive.
And so that's really who I'm talking about. I'm not trying to say that there isn't the possibility for better firms, but they just don't have the same kind of incentive structure, because they are purely capitalistic, as you say. So,
but there can be capitalism with the conscious. There can be someone that believes in making money and still doing
But
service.
EAB is owned by private equity.
I know.
And private equity usually is not, the words conscience and private equity usually
I know.
don't go
I'm not
together.
talking about EAB or R&L.
Yeah. So I will I'm not trying to go after Brian or human capital.
Friends, this concludes the second part of my 3-part interview with Don Hossler and Stephen Burd. Hope you'll join us next week for the final part.
And now it's time for our college spotlight of the week.
All right, Lisa, we were talking before we came on the air. It's been a while since we've gone old school college spotlight versus where we interview, and a senior leader at the college. It's been feels like a half a year or so.
Yeah, it's been a while, but I like these, even though they're more work, because it's more fun for me.
They are definitely more work. Cool. Well, our listeners have been asking for them. So we've got University of South Carolina up, and I tried to visit this school on our way to SACAC for 2023 and got COVID and ended up kind of just hanging out on campus, but not going near anybody because I didn't want to infect anybody. And then I got tired and went to the hotel. So I had to go back and do a real deeper dive. And this time I felt like I really understood the institution. And I feel it's a school that I can put on a lot of lists. And when we do these together, we always agree who will be the lead. So I'm the lead today, but Lisa's also visited a year or so ago. So definitely going to want you to kind of chime in on your thoughts as well. But, I'll dive in, so 5 to 7 years ago, nationally, I didn't ever heard about South Carolina, really. I just really didn't. In the Southeast, sure, it's the flagship of a major state, but I'm talking about outside of the region, from 6 hours away all the way to the other side of the country. The popular schools in the Southeast, the large publics, let's say 5, 7, 10 years ago, were Florida and Florida State, Georgia Tech, UVA, Virginia Tech, UNC, Alabama to a certain extent, since they started placing regionals all around the country, but you wouldn't hear really about Kentucky, Missouri, Arkansas, LSU. I had one student from Newport Beach go to LSU for their vet program, but really not much interest in LSU, not much interest in Auburn, or really till not that long ago, Clemson, South Carolina, or UTK, Tennessee, Knoxville. And if you said USC, everybody that was Southern California. That's the only USC anybody ever knew. But it's really in the last 5 to 7 years I've just seen so much interest nationally in South Carolina and also Clemson and Tennessee, Knoxville. And so I was totally intrigued by this school, and it's really only one state over. But I totally got the appeal when I got there. So first of all, it started with a cool story. So I did a self-guided tour. I wanted to do a self-guided tour because they have the one with you hear the sounds and they talk in your ear, and both the driving and a walking one. But then you can have deep dives with admissions people or tour guide. So I ended up having a one-on-one for almost an hour with a recent grad, and it's a totally cool story. So just when I was coming up, I heard him talking about he was from Massachusetts because the previous person he was talking to was from Massachusetts. And so, I'm in thinking, okay, this guy's from Massachusetts. So I started, I'm from Georgia. He goes, oh, I'm from Georgia. I said, hey, I thought you were from Massachusetts. And he says, oh, I was born there, but I really was raised in Georgia. And I said, where? He says, Peachtree City. And I'm like, shut up. Peachtree City is just right next door. That's where we shop. That's where we do everything. I'm like, well, I'm in Fairburn, And so he says, Fairburn? I went to school in Fairburn. I'm like, no way. So it turns out he's a graduate of Landmark Christian, where both my kids graduated. And then, so now we're okay, we're talking about all the people that we know. And then he's like, what were your kids' names? Joy and Carousel. He's like, I know the Stucker family. You wouldn't believe it's a small world. He grew up idolizing Joy because Joy's got a life-size photo of herself in the gym, for her athletic success. So it's just a really neat story. But I talked to him for a long time, and I'll tell you, I'm just going to dive in and tell you why I feel I can put this on so many lists. First of all, it's a city, and we know, Lisa, people don't like being in the middle of nowhere. And
That's
so,
true.
yes. So you get a city, 137,000, mid-sized city, capital city. I'll say more about that later, but it comes with many perks. Secondly, self-contained campus. Most of the time, people want a protected campus, a bubble campus, a campus feel. It's got, not only does it have that self-contained campus, but it's gorgeous.
It is beautiful.
Yes, it's really pretty. The oak trees, the landscaping, the historic buildings. And then if you want warm weather, which a lot of people want, you're going to get that. And then if you want great cost, you're going to get that. I mean, they start all in out of state in the low 50s, but 40 to 45% get merit scholarships, some of which are very generous. And they literally can bring your cost of attendance down to less than what your in-state cost might be, even for an in-state public in certain cases. And then a lot of people like school spirit. It has it in absolute spades. I know for me, that was like totally a deal breaker for me. When I was in my college search, I had to have that. That's like that. And that those are my funnest memories of college. It's just being at all the games. If you're someone that wants, all the revelry that comes with the big game, I mean, you just feel it immediately from the second you walk on the campus. And then I also felt that, it's a bigger school, but I felt the personal individual attention there in a way that I don't always feel when I'm on a larger school. And we'll kind of get into a few things in a minute. So we'll get into some of the reasons why I feel they have that. And then a few more things I would say is they have some very distinctive programs that are very strong, which we'll talk about. And, if you're one of these people that, as long as the school is really strong in my area of interest, then I'm interested. It's not so much the overall school, but my area of interest. They have a lot of programs that you're going to be really impressed with. And then while I would say that prestige is still lacking outside of the Southeast, it's definitely growing. It's a school that's hot. It's got momentum. It's kind of it's very friendly. And they've got an amazing honors college that's one of the top honors colleges in the country. And that can really put them into play for a lot of students from coast to coast. I was working with a student from New Jersey a couple of years ago. And like a lot of students that we work with, Lisa, they come into the process sort of not realizing, how competitive it is out there. And so, you have to have those hard conversations when they throw out UNC and UVA and UGA and, UF, Florida. And the student wanted warm weather. He wanted the big sports scene. He wanted the Southeast. And so, and it never worked out for him. He didn't get in UGA, didn't get in UVA, didn't get in UNC, he didn't get in Clemson or UF. And he was really down at first because he thought USC was the best of his options. Well, by the time he went to admitted student visit, he was so hooked on that school that even that Clemson took him off the wait list, he was like, no way, I'm going here. And he's happy as a lark. So I just think that's what a lot of people will discover, that, wow, when you get there, this place has a lot to offer. Now, I asked the recent grad who I sat down with. He worked in the admission office for 45 years. 45 years. What am I talking about?
45 minutes.
45 minutes, not years. Yeah. I know time goes by fast, but anyway, not slow. So I asked him, what are the biggest reasons out-of-state students come here? And everything he said resonated as true. He said the warm weather, the big SEC experience. He said the fact that it's seen as not necessarily the deep South, but mid-South. Now, you could argue South Carolina. We've talked about this off air before, Lisa. South Carolina and even North Carolina, they get a perception of being more gentler than the deep South states. They just do. It's not seen as Louisiana or Mississippi. He said the great out-of-state scholarships and the strength of the honors program, and then some of the distinctive programs that they have that are really strong. And then he also said something which I came to experience after I left, which is there is an aspect of which I think a lot of it is a school spirit, but there's a lot of intermingling with different types of kids. Like there's a sense in which we're kind of all in it together. You might be like fraternity kid, or you might be hardcore athlete, or you might be business guy or Mr. Global Studies, and they all kind of interact well. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I feel like partly what they do with their first year program, which I'll say a little bit more about later, and partly I think that school spirit just produces this kind of unifying bond with which I felt, when I was on the campus. And so I want to say a little about some of their stronger programs, and then I want to just let you share a few thoughts, and then I'll come back and share a lot of stuff about their admissions process, some of their stats, and some more things about their scholarships, which are incredibly generous. But as far as some of their top programs, I mean, if you look at like the programs that attract the most people, it's like finance and public health, biology, research experimental psychology, marketing, sports and fitness management, nursing, criminal justice, and political science and government. And a lot of times the programs that people select the most are their strongest, but there are also some other programs they have that are really stupendous. One is their vocal music program. Now, this happened to be what drew the recent grad that I spoke with, Owen is his name, what drew Owen there, because he wanted the big sports, and the school that my kids went to had a lot of school spirit. So he would be used to that with the pep rallies and all that. He wanted high academics, the big sports, but he also wanted top-notch music because he looked at a bunch of conservatory programs. So he was like that kind of musician. And he said, when it comes to vocal music, especially classical vocal music, I mean, he said, we have 3 professors from Juilliard, another one that consistently sings at the Metropolitan Opera, another sings at the Lincoln Center. And he said, probably the only schools that can really compete for classical vocal are, and especially if you want bigger school, are Florida State, Michigan, Indiana, University of Miami, USC. He said, if you don't need as big a school like Rochester, Belmont, and he looked at those, but they just didn't have the big sports scene. So it's one of your top programs. And then their honors college, oh my goodness. You get so many perks with that honors college. Obviously, you get some things that are pretty common, like priority class registration. That's pretty common. And, you get to be in your own dorm, your own honors dorm, which is also, pretty common. Very, very nice residence halls. By the way, their residence halls are pretty amazing. All new facilities that are really pretty impressive. But they also have a program where you can craft your own curriculum and do your own research projects. And honor students get top priority at those projects. They have a lot of special funding just for honors programs. They have special study abroad opportunities. They have honors theses. And they have 600 special courses just for honors college students. Sometimes honors college it's almost more marketing, especially honors programs, right? But here, like about half of the classes that the students take are in honors only classes. And they're totally taught differently. It's not lecture, it's Socratic method, it's discussion based. Average class size is 16. So about half your classes are going to be with really, really bright kids, first choice of courses. And that's pretty special. And then they also, it's about 11% of the students in the whole school are in the honors college. So that's an exceptional program. Then international business, the dollar more, the facilities, it's a really strong program. International business is amazing, but just overall business. It could be sales and marketing, could be international business. They have great faculty. They have great placement. Everybody has to study a language. Everybody has to go abroad in there. Those facilities are incredible. And the placement, and that's where another place where being in Columbia is great. They can really utilize the location. I was really impressed with their sports management program. It's in the hospitality, retail, and sports management school. And they have incredible connections. In fact, Owen told me about 5 of his friends who went through that program, and he told me what jobs they've gotten. They have this special relationship with the Masters because Augusta's only 70 minutes away. In fact, I stayed in Columbia, then the next night I stayed right in Augusta. So I know that drive is like an hour and 10 minutes. So he talked about, I have one friend that got a job with the Baltimore Ravens, another with the Brooklyn Nets, another with the Gamecock men's basketball team, and another one in Los Angeles. So that's really strong. Engineering's on the rise. I wouldn't say it's one of their marquee, but they just got a $30 million donation from an alum named Alex Marinaroli. Sorry if I butchered your name. So they're putting huge resources there. Their nursing program has a 99% pass rate on the NCLEX. And then they have a lot of great 3-3 programs. They've got 3-3 pharmacy programs. They've got 3-3 law programs. Like I said, criminal justice, public health, journalism. So they just have a lot of strong programs. But I'm tired of hearing my voice, Lisa. You tell me what you want to say. You also toured recently.
Yeah. Well, a few things. First off, I do agree with you that there is an overarching Gamecock spirit that seems to be more prevalent at University of South Carolina than at most other schools I visited. A tour guide told us the story of how her first day of school, she got lost. And some seniors came up to her and said, "What's up, baby Gamecock? Like, let's get you where you need to go." And every day for a week, they would meet her at her dorm and walk her to whatever classes that she needed to go to. And that just seems like that's sort of the spirit of that school, is that people are helpful to each other. It's a collaborative and cooperative space. I think it's a beautiful campus. It really is one of, really beautiful campus. I love the palm trees too. It just has definitely a really nice Southern feel. When I went, we toured the communications department quite extensively. And I was very impressed with their communications department, journalism, advertising, fantastic programs. And again, the thing that really sold me on it was they just had an incredible amount of personal advising for students in those programs. And their advising, I think, is really one of their strengths. And they made a point to say that unlike another school that has a strong communications department that would be a state school in the South, like UNC Chapel Hill, we're looking at you, they actually paid attention to their students in a very personal way, and they felt like they got better outcomes. I've probably mentioned this on the podcast before, but Lily and I got lost in the building, and we were looking for some meeting that got canceled, and a professor came by and she said, "Well, hey, are you guys lost?" And we explained, and she took us around the building for an hour. She showed us everything. She sat down with my daughter for another 30 minutes and talked to her about what she might want to do. And I've never had that happen at a tour with an academic professor. So in a way, it was very analogous to the lost baby Gamecock story that our tour guide had told. We got the same treatment there. The other thing I would say is and you'll probably touch on this, but it's gotten a lot more competitive. Especially since last year, they went to a auto admit for the top 10% of your class of South Carolina students. And here in North Carolina, a lot of students, we do know about the University of South Carolina, and a lot of kids want to go there, and they were a little bit surprised by their admissions decisions this last year. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I think from what I can tell, the merit was a little less generous. It was for Lily and I, it was our second choice. She didn't get into the Elon Fellows program. She was going to go to South Carolina. It was $10,000 less than the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign by the time it was all done.
And that was Lisa's home state. If you're a new listener,
yeah,
you think of Lisa as North Carolina, but she was, when Lily was in high school, she graduated from Vernon Hills from the local high school there.
Yeah. And so, it was $10,000 less to send Lily there. I didn't want to mention, in addition to the Honors College, they have another program, which I really love, which is called the Capstone Scholars. And it actually was a better fit for Lily because she's not like, a life of the mind kind of girl, but she is like all experiential and into fun and loves people. And this is a cohorted program where for 2 years, you live with your cohort and you go and you have a bunch of different experiences together. And there's a couple classes that you take. So it's another way of kind of making the university smaller. And I think usually, like, if you don't get into the Honors College, but you get invited, a lot of times you are invited to the Capstone program. So that's another option for people.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And I'll say a few things about that as well. I want to pick up on your advising point, Lisa. So they have a class called University 101, and it's an award-winning class. It's a first-year transition program, and it's started in 1972, so it's 52 years old. And college after college reaches out to them to find out what's their secret sauce, what are they doing. It's like an intentional onboarding experience that they have. And they claim sort of that they invented the first-year experience. I don't know if that's true or not, but they've certainly been doing it longer than most. And they basically help students make connections with each other. And they have like sessions on time management and all of that, but they really stand behind their program. Like they say, you don't have to do it. But if you look at people who go through it, they have a 9% higher retention rate. They have way higher GPAs. They've tested with alumni surveys, and the satisfaction is significantly higher for people that did their University 101. And they also cap those classes at 20 as well, where some of them, they do have a core program at USC. It's called the Carolina Core. And some of those Carolina Core lecture halls do get into the 200s in terms of number of students in the state, that get in. So that's that first year advising. Friends, this concludes the first part of our University of South Carolina College Spotlight. We hope you join us next week for part 2 of 3. Friends, on Monday's episode, Julia's going to join me, and we're going to be talking about a few things. We're going to talk about the pushback to the new SAVE plan as it runs into problems with the courts. And we're just going to say a few more comments of a topic we covered a couple weeks ago, University of Chicago's new ED program that some people are calling early ED or ED0. You're seeing both those names out there. I want to make a few more comments about that. And then we'll continue with the interview with Jay Rosner, one of the most knowledgeable people in the country when it comes to the SAT and the ACT, but also one of its most fiercest critics, self-described abolitionist. Jill and I will pepper him with the tough questions on the SAT and the ACT. And friends, remember, it's not where you go. It's not where you go. It's not where you go. But it's what you do when you get there, and it's what you do when you get out of there. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us, and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.